Oh, there's David Katz. Everyone, come on. How about it, David Katz? Good stuff. David, welcome. Now we hear you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm not on the video, though.
No, you're not on the video. We can do that next time if you want. It was just, we thought this was less of a high wire act, so we thought that this would be more dependable. Were Tony not here in studio with me, I doubt we would have even gotten this all working. But Tony, thank you.
I'm not gonna cry.
I'm close to crying, Tony.
I don't count that as a technical issue. I mean, that was a blip, right?
All right.
Thanks, Tony.
All right, Tony. Thank you. It was just
relatively speaking to this train wreck.
Yeah. When you need 2 minutes, right. That's true. Maybe it doesn't rise. If you're grading on a curve, it might not affect. David, I want to talk about the situation with the special counsel and how a prosecution of Donald Trump might actually unfold. I'm wondering if you can give us some reality checks on this special counsel, on the timeline, and the real potential outcomes here.
He's a very interesting person. You know, he actually was associated with the Senator John Edwards prosecution. That was a case that ended up having a hung jury, and then the Department of Justice didn't proceed against Edwards. But you'll remember that notorious case, really. But he was someone, who'd run for vice president on the Democratic ticket. He was a very high public official himself. Then he was also associated with the case of a governor from Virginia. That case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said there had to be more of a quid pro quo in a political bribery case. So he's certainly, been down that road where, he's fought the battles. He also has not endeared himself to the press because I guess he served some subpoenas on press sources because he felt that he needed that information. And of course, the press argues his shield laws, and those can go either way in the courts. So he's certainly been shown to be an aggressive prosecutor. He's a career prosecutor. He's not someone who's gone back and forth, in big government jobs. He didn't get a corner office. I don't think he's going to go for a corner office in a huge Washington, D.C. firm, which is, of course, what happened to Mueller. The Mueller investigation at the end of the day went nowhere. It got kind of buried by Barr, who very adroitly took advantage of Mueller not making a recommendation. And then they went from there, as we all remember, to Barr saying, you know what, there really wasn't any obstruction of justice. Since you left it up to me, good, thank you. I, Attorney General Barr, handpicked by Trump, find there's no obstruction of justice. So there's a good reason why everyone's wary about how this is going to come out, right?
Yeah, you don't have the kind of political hack in Garland as Attorney General that you do you did in Barr. But you have something I'd suggest here, and again, this is why I want to talk to you, because I understand that there are legal things that have to happen. There are processes that have to happen on the legal side, and that takes time. But it seems to me you have, one more thing now. Now there's a special counsel who'll preside over this that's going to take more time up. And as you begin to take time up, you see how you're rubbing up against an election, a general election, during which Trump will rise probably to the position of being the GOP nominee.
Well, I guess some people would fault Garland that he didn't do this appointment of a special prosecutor a year and a half ago. But I think we have to all remember the dynamics of it, which is that, first of all, the Mar-a-Lago case didn't really exist a year ago. They were negotiating with Trump. He was apparently having his front people. Trump was mislead the Department of Justice. He was getting subpoenas. Had the Department of Justice and Merrick Garland not gone through that process, Mark, can you imagine rush to judgment, railroading the ex-president? So I think certainly on that aspect of the case, at the time that was taken, needed to be taken before you could have a special prosecutor. They needed to litigate that case. There was the judge handpicked by Trump down the road, the one that we call loose cannon. She did everything, I think, to obstruct the case and help Trump. Didn't work. Even the conservative circuit down there ruled against her. The Supreme Court didn't give Trump any relief. Now, as to the January 6th case, I guess you can find fault that the Department of Justice spent so much time on the marauders. They certainly needed to be prosecuted. But the reality was only a few of them were going to lead to Trump. Why not jump right to the few who might lead to Trump and see what you could do? You know, the insiders with Trump, yes, they could have been given immunity before if they were given immunity now. I guess all that can be said on that was that I think that Liz Cheney, Thompson, Adam Schiff, that committee did a wonderful patriotic duty, and they shone a light, right, on what happened on January 6th and of Trump's complicity with it, all the lead up to it, Mark, all the fraud that then when the fraud didn't work, when the alternate slates, all the nonsense, the, what do you call it, the arm twisting of state officials, some Republicans who stood up to their duty and didn't go along with Trump's, subverting the count, subverting the delegates. Then Trump turned to violence. And then you had this January 6th, which was really dramatic. At the same time, the Republicans wouldn't even pursue it. Remember, Trump was impeached on this, and he was acquitted by almost all the Republican members of the Senate, whether one or two who would have convicted him in the Senate for this very impeachment, for this very insurrection. So, Mark, Attorney General, I think Garland, he needed to have the light shone on it for himself, for his own deputies. I think that the January 6th committee did a really marvelous job of that. And so it got to the point where I think that as there had to be some progress on that case. So at that point, and that's only fairly recently, the last few months, Garland had to either go with it himself and his staff, his deputies, or he had to appoint a special prosecutor. And I think that given all of that, then he had to pick the right special counsel. Now, you mentioned the legal problems. Now this special counsel, who's returning from Europe because he's involved with cases of war crimes before The Hague in the Netherlands, he's got to come back. He's got to set up an office. He's got to select staff. I mean, loads of talented people will want to work on this case. But there is a certain amount of time to simply gear up. Yes, that's some more months. And then there's all these processes. Trump will fight it tooth and nail. He'll file every motion, every court you can imagine, delay. And yes, to try to run out the clock until he runs again and hopefully wins. If he somehow wins in November 2024, people say maybe if it goes really fast, he'll be in the penitentiary. Even if he were in the penitentiary, he'd pardon himself. He'd fire the special prosecutor. He'd assume office. If he could somehow win in 2024, even with this albatross around his neck, he would assume office. So this case has to move forward. But as I said during the Mueller probe, Mark, this is up to the people. This is up to the voters. This is up to organizing, registering voters, going out and vote. Don't wait for this guy Smith to save the country any more than people who waited for Mueller to save the country from Trump.
That's a fair point. But boy, I think the people have spoken in a sense. I mean, the people did speak in the midterms. The people spoke in the repudiation of Trump in the general in 2020. So I feel as though at some point I'm asking for the Justice Department to step up and actually do the work that they do with average citizens, which is holding them to account. And here we have Trump, who's essentially allowed to skate. He's right. He gets away with it. And I'll tell you something else, David, and I push back on me on any of this stuff. They are not going to prosecute Trump. I know they have a special counsel dedicated to this. They are not going to prosecute Trump in any lasting way that would lead to a plea to a felony or any of these other things that you just know Trump's not going to do on this documents case. I don't care if he's got 11,000 of them. They are going to let him go one way or the other. Delay. Or now, tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I think that there's a problem, a practical problem, whether these two cases could be joined or whether they should be severed, even if they were joined by the prosecutor. It may sound highly technical, but think about the Washington, D.C. insurrection January 6th case. It seems to clearly have its venue in Washington, D.C. The other one seems to have its venue more likely in the Southern District of Florida, where Trump will argue it's a related case and ought to go back to his hand-picked Judge Cannon down the road, okay? Even if you can get around that problem and join the two of them up together and bring the January 6th insurrection case in Washington, D.C., and then you argue that Trump really committed the crime that we associate with Mar-a-Lago in Washington, D.C., that there was an affirmative act, that part of that conspiracy, that course of conduct as to Mar-a-Lago happened in Washington, D.C., because he made the decision in Washington, D.C., and he took documents he wasn't entitled to take in Washington, D.C. But just think of what his defenses are going to be. I didn't form that intent in Washington, D.C. I boxed everything up. I didn't, beyond a reasonable doubt, form the intent until I got down to Mar-a-Lago. I was still the president at the time that I did that. There's all these rules about indicting a president. I know he's not a sitting president anymore. You can see just off the top of my head, I thought of 2 or 3 motions that would be brought. Having said all that, it should all be brought, I believe, from what I've heard so far, in Washington, D.C. It should be brought well before November 2024. They should fight like hell in all the courts to not allow any of the delays that Trump and just laugh at the courts, just lampoon any court that delays the case in a very, lawyerly, right, scholarly way, but lampoon the fact that justice delayed is justice denied, and they need to get on with this. And there's a lot of rules that say criminal defendants cannot just kick the can down the road. Having said that, we criminal defense attorneys, and I'm one right now, are always accused by critics of kicking the can down the road, that any delay is good for the defense, that an adjournment is a win, and that that's certainly going to be the ethos, that'll be the philosophy of Trump's lawyers, and he'll get very good ones. Because if he's going to spend that $200 million that he got from his base in the great ripoff, believe me, he's going to spend it on protecting his own hide and keeping his lovely orange head out of the penitentiary.
We're talking to David Katz, who is the brilliant former assistant U.S. attorney. You can see him on Twitter at David Katz Law, and he's just a great legal mind who visits with us on Tuesdays. We really poached him from Pat Thurston when Pat's show went off the air. So he's so graciously joining us by phone. Tomorrow we'll have a video feed. I want to just mention something that was mentioned in the chat, and that is that Smith, apparently the special counsel, is in court today. So even as we talk about the slowness of the process, this is to essentially talk about the 11,000 documents seized at Mar-a-Lago and the special master, who is dealing with the documents. So they're going to consider whether a special master should indeed be reviewing the 11,000 documents seized at Mar-a-Lago. This is after the Justice Department now is going in saying the special master is unwarranted, essentially, in this case. It's kind of an argument that we saw them tap out on already, right, David? I mean, the Justice Department sort of has allowed the special master forward in reviewing these documents.
Well, the big concern that the Department of Justice had, Mark, about the special master and the whole way that Judge Cannon down there in the Southern District of Florida was handling the case was that the national security would be delayed. But they managed to, with the help of with the order of the Court of Appeals down there, the Federal Court of Appeals, the review for national security problems with those documents has resumed. And so in terms of slowing down the actual prosecution of Trump by going through the documents, that got slowed down anyway by the special prosecutor that now has to get up to speed. No matter how brilliant he is, no matter how talented his staff is, obviously it's a period of time to get up to speed.
Sure.
But my thought about that case, Mark, is that you would take the documents, if you were the prosecutor, that would shield or that in Trump's mind would shield him from prosecution for January 6th. You take the documents and you would highlight them. And so there would be one January 6th conspiracy. That would be all the things that he did that were terrible January 6th, fomenting the insurrection, encouraging people, the big lie that he told and exploited Trump did. You would take all that, and then you would have another act in furtherance of the same conspiracy to cover it up. That would be taking the documents that he had no right to, that would implicate him. So you would focus more on the documents that implicated him. And by now, they'll be able to put together what document implicated him. So, for instance, if there was something that showed that he talked to the Secret Service and told them to do this or that, documents that the Secret Service has since destroyed, not turned over, that we've had this whole back and forth about, and ultimately you can't get these text messages that they sent. Well, who knows? Trump may have taken documents that shed light on that and that hurt Trump. So you see how it would all dovetail with January 6th and the things he did in furtherance of January 6th. On January 6th, this retention of documents that he wasn't entitled to, not turned over, would be part of the cover-up, and it would all have its venue in Washington, D.C., and it should all be able to move forward promptly. You know, one thing is that the previous special prosecutor, Mueller, he had every impediment in the world compared to this fellow. First of all, he was a career Republican. Let's not forget all about that. And the Republicans who chose him, like Sessions, had a pretty good idea of what they were getting with Mueller. And what they got with Mueller was, let's face it, no prosecution forcefully recommended as Trump. There's no reason to think that this fellow Smith won't forcefully recommend prosecution of Trump. Now, at that point, you know, the attorney general still has to sign off on it, but he'd have a report in his hands. And of course, he has no motive to not go forward with it. Barr had a huge motive when he got the report to issue that, that sort of a 4-page summary that was not a summary, that misdirected the public and, it gave Trump the opportunity to say, no collusion, no obstruction, right?
Right.
It gave him the basis to say no collusion, no obstruction. He won't have that this time around. And there was also the constant threat, like Comey was fired, like these other people were fired, that Mueller would be fired. I mean, every day Mueller was walking on eggshells, and so was his staff, that they'd simply be fired. There'd be a Saturday night massacre, and what's going to happen then? This won't have to walk on eggshells. So he should move forward vigorously. And at the end of the day, my assessment as a former federal prosecutor is that there's really an overwhelming case against Trump for many aspects of inciting that insurrection. I mean, it was another one of his crimes that Trump did in front of our face. We all saw it happen. The law is not an ass. The law should get it right, just like we all got it right. This is not jumping to conclusions. This is not rush to judgment. We saw what happened. We saw his speech on the ellipse. We saw that Cassie Hutchinson's testimony, he wanted to grab the square. He wanted to lead the charge in there. He wanted to help intimidate Pence and the other people so that they wouldn't certify that election that Biden had obviously won. And then you have all the not tamping it down, the watching TV for 3.5 hours while they were going hang Mike Pence and everything else. So let's not forget what we saw and heard, all of us, what the January 6th committee proved, that there is an overwhelming case, I believe, that Trump is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of federal crimes for which he should be prosecuted in Washington, D.C., and no reason it can't happen before November of 2024. That's 2 years away.
I talked about in the last hour the case of this teacher who molested, allegedly, these kids. It happened in Danville. And then I talked about the institution protecting itself. And I mentioned in the case of molestation, the Penn State case, where Jerry Sandusky was, he was doing it for a long, long time. And the university was protecting the institution of Penn State, and that's why they didn't act. And then the Catholic Church protects the institution of the Catholic Church, et cetera. So what does that have to do with this? Let me just make my point, and that is that I think there are institutions in Washington that protect themselves the same way. You have a lawless president who sowed the seeds of an insurrection, of a coup. He did it in a lot of different ways. And you have this obvious thing that he did where he takes the 11,000 documents. My God, you got video, you've got, the government tried to negotiate with him. That's, to me, the institution protecting the other institution of the presidency. And my point is, David, I worry that the effort to protect the institution of government and the solidity of government and democracy and all that crap that they serve up to us all the time, I'm worried that jams the enthusiasm with which they prosecute or with which they hold someone who was president of the United States to account for what he did.
Well, you look at this prosecutor, and as I say, he was involved with the prosecution of John Edwards. People were very upset at Edwards at the time because of the whole thing with his wife and his infidelity and her cancer diagnosis, right? At the same time, I had my real doubts that the Edwards case made a lot of sense. To me, that was overzealous prosecution.
He was prosecuted. Remind us what he was prosecuted for.
So he gets money from somebody who wants to give him $1 million because she's a huge fan of his. And then he spends the $1 million not on the campaign, but basically on paying hush money to his mistress. And so it was a little bit like, it's so funny because the Republicans talk about what Trump was guilty of, I believe guilty of, allegedly guilty of, what Michael Cohen had to plead guilty for. What he went to prison for, which was paying this hush money to the two girlfriends of Trump so that they wouldn't come forward right before the election and say they'd had affairs with him, right? It was a misuse of campaign contributions, completely lampooned and laughed at by the Republicans as being a basis to prosecute Trump. And yet it was used by this prosecutor as a basis, this fellow Smith, who just got appointed, to prosecute John Edwards. Ultimately, unsuccessfully, Edwards was never convicted of anything. The case was dropped after a hung jury. He also went after the governor of Virginia, who was a Republican. So he does, and he gave the press a real hard time in a way I don't agree with. My point is, he seems like he's very aggressive. He doesn't seem like any kind of shrinking violet. And I think that he and his staff will go after Trump vigorously if that's what the law and the evidence is. And from what I've seen so far, the law and the evidence are pretty overwhelming. So I don't think that people should despair. But at the same time, the point that I was trying to make before, that we shouldn't also hope that the ultimate remedy to Trump getting power again is going to be Smith. That, you look at the elect. Trump was he was a drag on the Republicans, and yet historically they still managed to eke back a victory in the House, much less than people thought. No red wave, but enough that they can drive the administration crazy. They can't do much else. But, we're going to know about Hunter Biden until our ears bleed, right? And they're not going to let Adam Schiff, who's a totally distinguished member of Congress, even be on a committee. It's all payback and pettiness. But so now Trump runs again, and 3 or 4 people run against him. Nikki Haley and Pompeo and DeSantis down in Florida. And guess what? He ekes out a victory again, and now he's the nominee in 2024. And then either Biden or, let's say, Harris run, and they just end up not being a very popular candidate. And lo and behold, right, the same thing. They win by 10 million votes they win by 10 million votes, but the Electoral College just ekes out a victory for Trump. I mean, people need to be aware Trump would take office again, and it's a really scary thing for those of us who lived through 4 years of him being in office and the run up to it and everything he's done since. So that's why I just always say, organize, vote, take the issues seriously, and do everything you can to make sure that Trump doesn't win the primaries and doesn't win the election. And that's something we can't all just sit around and wait for Special Prosecutor Smith to save us from.
Fair enough. He is David Katz, the former assistant U.S. attorney. You can see him here or hear him here on Tuesdays. Next week, we're going to go for the entire shooting match, right? We're going to go for video and audio. So it's something to look forward to. I know. It's exciting. But for now, David, thank you so much. You're so generous. Love your takes on things. They're so important. And we wish you a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to all, and great to be with you, Mark.
All right. See you, David Katz, everyone. Yeah.